Hello everyone, welcome back to the course Development Economics 2. We are currently discussing the topic of historical perspective of globalization, and this is the second lecture in the series. In this lecture, we will be learning about few things as follows. To continue, we will continue our understanding of how globalization has evolved in the post-war era. We will also understand the major policy choices that shaped the extent of global integration. We will also understand the policies and factors that contributed to this process. We will also look at the timeline of development of institutions like GATT and WTO, and we will also understand the importance of FDI and portfolio investment, technology and cheap labor in the current phase of globalization. Now, in the last lecture, we have discussed the timeline of globalization up to the World War era, right? We will continue our discussion in the historical timeline fashion, but before that, let us shift our focus to some crucial choices made by policymakers in the post-World War era, right? So, here is the first one of them, right? So, after World War II, the major Western nations embraced interdependence, where trade was an engine of both growth and peace, right? So, when the victory of Allied forces was in sight, policymakers and world leaders were actually very prompt in planning the next phase of reconnecting and globalization, and they actually saw interdependence as a means to fostering growth and peace, right? They saw trade as a way to generate both economic and political benefits. So, if countries are interdependent economically, it will be in their vested interest, or they will have incentive to not go into political conflicts in future, right? So, this commitment to interdependence established the foundation for globalization as we know it today. Coming to the second choice. The second choice was to fight back against stagflation and Keynesian policies. In the 1970s, industrial economies faced economic doldrums, including stagflation. So, these policymakers and world leaders, they saw this problem as a result of following Keynesian policies. So, they tried to reverse these policies, and they tried to harmonize fiscal and monetary policies and deeper economic integration beyond trade. This event set the stage for more extensive globalization beyond just trade. Coming to the third choice. The third choice was to take lessons from economies which were closed even in the post-war era up to periods like 1990s, right? The failure of these closed economies and their reintegration into the global market economy was a critical moment in the globalization we know today. These countries saw the need to catch up and thus embraced global trade. They welcomed foreign corporations and established capital markets in their own economies. This event created the possibility for globalization to become comprehensive, relentless, and increasingly new. So, these three choices actually contributed and shaped the globalization as we know today, and it actually resulted into a higher level of integration and interconnectedness of economies throughout the world, right? So, going further, we will look at the re-globalization in the post-war era, how countries rebuild themselves through reconnecting themselves in a global level. The period following World War II marked by was marked by efforts to build a more peaceful and prosperous world. Political leaders recognized the need to learn from the mistakes of the past, and they tried to build institutions and policies to support financial stability and international cooperation. Now, here is a question to think about. Why and how did international institutions like IMF, World Bank and WTO come about? So these policymakers and world leaders actually felt the need of global institutions which will be instrumental in materializing the interconnected world they envisioned, right? So for this purpose they convened Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, even before the Second World War was over, and in this was a watershed moment, so as to say, for global institutions or for globalization for that matter. Why? Because in this Bretton Woods Conference, 3 global institutions were planned, right? One of them was International Monetary Fund, second was the World Bank, and third was an organization called International Trade Organization, or ITO. Out of these 3, 2 actually materialized. So the IMF and World Bank actually came into existence, where IMF was designed as an international credit union to lend member countries in during their financial difficulties. World Bank was intended to lend its member countries to promote reconstruction and support development projects in poor nations. But the International Trade Organization was not materialized. Why? Because there were some world leaders, they were not confident, at least at that point of time, to bring down their protective trade barriers, right? So they planned to create ITO, but protectionist opposition in the US Congress in 1950 killed the concept of ITO. In place of ITO, the Provisional Agreement and Organization, named General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, was established in 1947 with 23 founding member countries. Now, GATT had primarily 2 purposes. First, to provide rules of international trade, and second, to promote liberalization and expansion of trade, right? So GATT was profoundly important in providing framework for an expansion of trade, right? So the scope of GATT was obviously not as broad as the planned ITO, but still GATT played an important role in promoting globalization and world trade in the subsequent years. So until mid 1980s, GATT had many successful rounds of negotiations that resulted in significant reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers. So there were many rounds of GATT, successful rounds of GATT, but in 1986, the Uruguay round of negotiations was launched with a focus on expanding the scope of GATT to include services and intellectual property. So GATT didn't have clauses to make a framework on trade in services and intellectual properties. So this round was intended to include these aspects. So this round of negotiation also aimed to establish a more comprehensive trade agreement which would eventually become the World Trade Organization. This round was concluded, meaning the Uruguay round, concluded in 1995 with the establishment of the World Trade Organization, or WTO, as a successor of GATT. So GATT was in place of GATT, the organization called WTO came about. The WTO is a permanent institution with a broader mandate and than GATT, and it also included the regulation of trade in services and intellectual property. In specific terms, these two aspects of WTO were called General Agreement on Trade in Services or GATTs, and secondly the Agreement on Trade Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights or TRIPS. World Bank also had a new thing. It was dispute settlement mechanism, right? So WTO played an instrumental role in subsequent years till now in cases of disputes related to international or bilateral trades, right? So WTO has a whole framework or bodies who will take complaints and try to settle disputes among its members. So broadly speaking, WTO provided stability, predictability and confidence in free trade to its member nations. Now here is a question to think about. Why and how did international institutions like IMF, World Bank and WTO come about? Now let us look at an interesting chart here. This chart basically shows an index which shows the level of impediments to trade. This index basically includes tariff rates plus transportation costs. So as we can see, starting from 1870s, these barriers or impediments of trade have consistently come down up to the pre-World War era. In the inter-World War era, again this barrier to trade have risen as we have discussed before, and in the post-World War era, these barriers to trade have again significantly come down. This chart shows the average tariff rates in percentage terms between 1982 and 2015. This also shows that countries have consistently brought down their own tariff rates. So these two charts basically shows how countries become increasingly more and more open to trade historically. Now these political developments, meaning the establishment of the global institutions and in specific terms the WTO, and the policies taken by various developed countries, these political developments provided the framework for expansion of free trade. But it would not be possible, it is important to note that it would not be possible without remarkable technological progress in transportation and communication technologies, right? Once again, as we have seen historically, technological progress is the factor which actually made higher levels of or more interconnected trade possible throughout the history, right? So for example, in this era, post-World War era, faster and larger vessels were available due to technological progress. Technology also enabled containerization, which basically made packaging and shipping goods and goods across the world much more cost effective, much more cheaper. And next is advent of jet engines for aircrafts, which brought down cost of air travel significantly, air travel and cost of air travel and air freight significantly. And finally, coming to communication technologies, cost of telephonic communication came down dramatically in this period. So trade volumes, especially by the developed nations, soared once again in the post-World War era. Worldwide trade once again rose to 1914 levels. In 1989, export once again counted for 14% of global GDP. This chart shows that how technological progress actually brought down cost of sea freight cost, cost of passenger air transport, and cost of international calling. In particular, in 2005, the cost of international calling almost came around zero, right? Also, we can see that other costs have also come down significantly in this period. Until 1989-90, there were some countries that were practicing some or the other kinds of import substitution industrialization policies, or in short we call this ISI policies. These economies were experiencing stagflations, right? Some of these economies were influenced by command and control policies as was practiced in Soviet Union at that point of time, and some other countries were still holding on to the policy of import substitution, right? And these countries at that point of time were experiencing stagnation. So income was not rising in these countries. Finally, the watershed moment of fall of Berlin Wall in 1989 and dissolution of Soviet Union in 1991 convinced these countries to finally integrate themselves with the world economy. So a very significant moment in the history of globalization. The objective of these economies was to catch up in this point of time. So they were obviously way behind the countries who adopted free trade or adopted openness very soon after World War II, right? These countries did not do that, and as a result they fell behind. So now they wanted to catch up. For this process of catch up, only openness and trade was not sufficient. They needed significant investment from outside. This development made globalization much broader in scope. So newer countries integrated themselves into the world economy. Total world trade grew in the 1980s at an annual rate of 4.5%. In the 1990s, the average annual rate was 6.8% compared with the annual world GDP growth of only 3.2%. The value of world trade doubled in the 1990s to almost $8 trillion. Now here is a question to think about. What are the risks of cross-border investments? Now we will discuss about the second stage of globalization. Starting from mid 1980s, the scale and pace of FDI also accelerated. So as we have discussed, these newly integrating countries needed much more than only openness or trade. They needed investment. Now cross-border investment are of two kinds. One is foreign direct investment, which meant companies from outside or foreign companies will set up factories, offices, restaurants, hotel chains, so on and so forth in the host countries. This was foreign direct investment. And there is also foreign portfolio investment or FPI. So portfolio investments are basically investments in financial instruments like stocks, bonds, etc. So we are here talking about FDI. right? In 1980s, the scale and pace of FDI accelerated. The volume of FDI was more than $800 billion in 1999. Of this total, more than 3/4 or 3/4 went to developed countries. Why? Because these developed countries were much more lucrative for investment at that point of time. In the following years, FDI proved to be important driver of economic growth in host countries. FDI increased to over $1.4 trillion in 2019. Financial markets around the world also started to be integrated into the integrated or interconnected with each other. The communication technology and ICT revolution has been a major enabler of this trend. So, because of better information technology, people could have access to markets, financial markets, which was not available before, right? So, developing countries with high growth potential have attracted most of portfolio investments. Portfolio investments increased from $1.2 trillion in 1990 to over $23 trillion in 2019. So, this brings us to the current age of globalization, right, where all these trends are still going on. The advent of information and communication technology and internet has catapulted all this process into much faster rate of growth, right. So, world economies are integrating at a much faster pace right now. So, this chart here basically shows us the historical timeline of what we have discussed so far. Here are some take-home points from this lecture for you. Active policy choices and technological progress actually made possible the post-war re-globalization. New institutions like GATT and WTO played crucial role in this process. Failure of closed economies and subsequent opening up of them provided boost in the integration process. And finally, role of FDI and portfolio investment has been significant in accelerating integration and growth of developing countries. Thank you.